The California desert has always held a certain allure for me. Its vast, seemingly endless expanses of sand and rock, punctuated by hidden oases and otherworldly geological formations, have a way of making you feel both insignificant and alive. It's a place of extremes, where the scorching heat of the day gives way to bone-chilling cold at night, where life clings tenaciously to existence in the most unlikely places. It was this fascination with the desert that led me and a group of friends to plan a hiking trip to Fossil Falls, just outside of Ridgecrest, California, about 25 years ago. None of us could have anticipated that this adventure would lead us into a mystery that continues to haunt me to this day. Our group consisted of four of us: myself, my best friend, his girlfriend, and our mutual friend. We were all in our early 20s, full of energy and eager to explore. My best friend was the most experienced hiker among us, having grown up in a family that regularly went on camping trips. His girlfriend was newer to hiking, but enthusiastic about the outdoors. Our other friend was our resident jokester, always ready with a quip to lighten the mood. As for me, I fell somewhere in the middle. I enjoyed outdoor activities, but wouldn't have called myself an expert by any means. We set out early on a Saturday morning in late spring. The drive from Los Angeles to Ridgecrest took about 3 hours, during which we watched the landscape transform from urban sprawl to rugged desert. As we neared our destination, the anticipation in the car was palpable. We'd all seen photos of Fossil Falls online, but nothing could prepare us for the reality of the place. Fossil Falls is a geological wonder, a remnant of the Pleistocene era when water from the Owens River carved intricate patterns into the basaltic lava flow. The result is a series of smooth, undulating rock formations that look more like abstract sculptures than natural phenomena. As we parked our car and gathered our backpacks, I remember feeling a sense of awe at the alien landscape before us. The hike down into the falls was relatively easy, though we had to watch our footing on the smooth, worn rock. We took our time, pausing often to take photos and marvel at the otherworldly formations around us. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rock face, creating an ever-changing landscape of light and dark. It wasn't until we reached the bottom of the falls and entered the opening of the canyon that things took a turn for the bizarre. The first thing that hit us was the smell. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the scent of sun-baked rock and desert vegetation. But as we continued our hike, it grew stronger. "Do you guys smell that?" my friend's girlfriend asked, wrinkling her nose. We all nodded, looking at each other with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The odor was unmistakable, the sickly sweet smell of decay. "Probably just a dead animal," my best friend suggested, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "It happens out here all the time." We continued on, but the smell only intensified. It was becoming difficult to ignore, and I could see the others were as unsettled as I was. There was something deeply wrong about that smell, something that went beyond the normal cycle of life and death in the desert. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested, but curiosity had gotten the better of us. We had come this far, and something in us needed to know the source of that awful stench. As we pressed on, the canyon walls seemed to close in around us. The bright, open expanse of the desert gave way to shadowy, claustrophobic passages. The smell grew stronger with each step, until it was almost overpowering. We pulled our shirts up over our noses in a futile attempt to filter the air. That's when we saw it. In a small clearing ahead, the ground looked different. There were several dark patches on the surface, like oil slicks, but they didn't quite look like oil. The earth around these patches appeared disturbed, as if someone had been digging recently. We approached cautiously, our earlier excitement replaced by a growing sense of dread. The smell was so strong here that it made our eyes water. My best friend, always the brave one, stepped forward to investigate. "Guys," he said, his voice muffled by the shirt covering his face, "I think someone's been burying something here." We gathered around, morbid curiosity overcoming our revulsion. The patches on the ground were indeed the result of recent digging. Whatever had been buried was just below the surface. Should we dig? Our jokester friend asked, his usual joking manner completely gone. We looked at each other, uncertain. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But another part, the part that had gotten us this far, needed to know. My best friend pulled a small folding shovel from his backpack. "We'll just take a look," he said. "If it's just a dead animal, we'll leave it be and get out of here." He began to dig at one of the patches. The smell, impossibly, grew even stronger. We'd barely gone 6 inches down when he stumbled back, gagging. "Oh God," he choked out. "We need to get out of here, now." We didn't need to be told twice. Whatever was buried there, it wasn't a simple case of a dead desert animal. The smell spoke of something far worse, something that had no place in this beautiful, desolate landscape. As we hurried back the way we came, the reality of what we might have stumbled upon began to sink in. This wasn't just a hike gone wrong. We might be dealing with something far more sinister. "We need to call the police," my friend's girlfriend said as we climbed out of the canyon. No one argued. Once we were back at our car and had cell phone reception, we made the call. The dispatcher seemed skeptical at first, but when we described the location and the smell, her tone changed. She assured us a patrol car would be there soon. We waited by our vehicle, all of us quiet, lost in our own thoughts. The beautiful desert landscape that had so captivated us earlier now seemed ominous, potentially hiding dark secrets beneath its sun-baked surface. When the police car arrived, a single officer stepped out. He introduced himself, his weathered face speaking of years of experience. As we recounted our story, I could see a change come over him. His initial professional detachment gave way to a grim focus that sent chills down my spine. "Show me," he said simply. We led the officer back down into the canyon. As we neared the site, I saw his posture change. He became more alert, his hand resting near his holstered weapon. When the smell hit him, he stopped in his tracks. "Wait here," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. We watched as he approached the disturbed ground. He circled the area, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. Then he pulled out his radio and began speaking rapidly into it. I couldn't make out the words, but the urgency in his tone was clear. When he returned to us, his face was grave. "I'm going to need you folks to head back to your car and wait there," he said. "We're going to have a lot more people coming in soon." "What is it?" my best friend asked. "What did you see?" The officer hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Look," he said, his voice low. "I used to work homicide in LA. That smell, for something to generate that kind of odor, you'd need something big, deer-sized at least, and recently buried." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all of us. This wasn't just a dead animal. This could be a crime scene. As we made our way back to the parking area, we could hear the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. Police vehicles began to arrive, their sirens cutting through the desert quiet. The peaceful hiking spot we had visited just hours ago was transforming into a hive of law enforcement activity. We were questioned separately by detectives, recounting our story over and over. As the day wore on, we watched as more and more officials arrived. There were people in hazmat suits, forensics teams, even what looked like federal agents in dark suits despite the desert heat. It was well past sunset by the time we were allowed to leave. We were told to expect follow-up calls and were sworn to secrecy about what we had seen. The drive back to Los Angeles was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts about the day's events. Over the next few weeks, we waited anxiously for news. We had been told not to discuss the incident with anyone, but it was hard not to speculate among ourselves. What had we stumbled upon? Was it really what we feared? Evidence of a terrible crime? When we finally received a call from the police, The answer we got was far from satisfactory. According to the official report, what we had found was nothing more than some discarded chicken skin and bones. The smell, they claimed, had been exaggerated by the heat in the enclosed space of the canyon. None of us believed it for a second. The memory of that overpowering stench, the grim reaction of the officer, the massive response from law enforcement, none of it lined up with the explanation we were given. But what could we do? We were just a group of hikers who had stumbled upon something we didn't understand. It might have ended there, filed away as a strange and unsettling experience, if not for a chance conversation I had with a coworker a few months later. I had been careful not to discuss the incident, following the instructions we had been given. But one day, over lunch, my coworker mentioned he was planning a hiking trip to Fossil Falls. The memory of that day came flooding back, and before I could stop myself, I found myself warning him to be careful. My coworker, sensing there was more to my concern than general hiking safety, pressed for details. Under his persistent questioning, I finally relented and shared a brief version of our experience. I expected skepticism, maybe even laughter. What I didn't expect was the look of concern that crossed his face. He leaned in close, lowering his voice despite the busy cafeteria around us. "Listen," he said. "I've got a friend who works high up in the Department of Forestry Service. Let me run this by him. See what he says." I hesitated, remembering the stern warnings we'd received about discussing the incident. But curiosity won out, and I nodded my agreement. A week passed before my coworker approached me again. This time he looked troubled. He pulled me aside into an empty conference room, checking twice to ensure we were alone before he spoke. "I told my friend about what happened," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Man, I've never heard him react like that before." He said, and I quote, "How did you know about this? You shouldn't know about this, and those guys should forget about it immediately." A chill ran down my spine. The official dismissal of our experience had been unsettling, but this reaction was downright alarming. It confirmed what we had suspected all along. There was more to this story than we were being told. "What do you think it means?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. My coworker shook his head. "I don't know for sure, but it's big. Whatever you guys stumbled upon, it's something they're desperate to keep quiet." Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Maybe it was paranoia, but I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, scrutinizing unfamiliar cars on my street. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but the nagging sense of unease persisted. I reached out to my friends who had been with me that day, curious if they had experienced anything similar. To my surprise, they all reported odd occurrences. One mentioned strange clicks on his phone line. Another swore she'd seen the same nondescript sedan parked outside her apartment several times. Our usually laid-back friend admitted to feeling on edge, like he was constantly being observed. As we pieced together our experiences, a disturbing theory began to take shape. The location of our discovery, the massive law enforcement response, the unconvincing cover story, and now these hints of surveillance, it all pointed to something far more sinister than we had initially imagined. I began to research the area around Fossil Falls more thoroughly. That's when I discovered something that made the pieces start to fall into place. The canyon we had explored that day was not just a remote hiking spot. It was bordered by the China Lake Naval Weapons Center, a vast military installation known for its secretive weapons testing programs. The implications were chilling. If someone had been killed and buried on government land, it would explain the desperate attempt to keep the incident under wraps. The military's involvement would account for the high-level cover-up and the ongoing surveillance we seemed to be experiencing. But who was the victim? And more importantly, who was responsible? These questions haunted me, keeping me awake at night as I turned over the possibilities in my mind. I considered going to the media with our story, but the fear of repercussions held me back. We had no proof beyond our word, and the thought of going up against a government cover-up was terrifying. Plus, there was no guarantee that sharing our story wouldn't put us in even more danger. As the months turned into years, the intensity of our experience faded, but it never truly left us. We moved on with our lives, careers advanced, relationships changed, we spread out across the country. But that day in Fossil Falls remained a bond between us, a shared secret that we carried. Now, 25 years later, I find myself still pondering the events of that day. The smell, the disturbed earth, the massive response, and the subsequent cover-up. It all feels as vivid as if it happened yesterday. I've never returned to Fossil Falls, and I doubt I ever will. The beauty of the desert has been forever tainted by the memory of what we discovered there. I've come to accept that I may never know the full truth of what happened in that canyon. But I'm certain of one thing. On that spring day 25 years ago, we stumbled upon something that was never meant to be found. A secret buried in the desert, protected by forces far more powerful than we could have imagined. As I write this account, I'm aware of the risks involved in sharing this story, but I believe it's important that the truth, or at least as much of it as we know, comes to light. Perhaps someone out there has a missing piece of this puzzle, or maybe this will encourage others who have had similar experiences to come forward. To this day, I can't look at a map of the California desert without my eyes being drawn to that small dot marking Fossil Falls. It serves as a reminder that even in the vast emptiness of the desert, secrets can be buried, and that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are those that remain unsolved. The experience has left me with a profound unease about the power structures that govern our world. It's shaken my faith in official narratives and made me question how much of what we're told is really the truth. How many other secrets are out there, buried in remote locations, protected by official denials and shadowy surveillance? I often wonder about that first officer, the one who seemed to understand the gravity of what we had found. Did he face pressure to change his story? Was he part of the cover-up? Or was he, like us, silenced by forces beyond his control? And what of the victim, if indeed there was one? Someone's loved one, perhaps, whose fate remains unknown, whose body lies in an unmarked grave in the unforgiving desert. The thought that we might have been close to bringing them justice, only to have it snatched away, is a burden I carry to this day. The incident at Fossil Falls has colored my perception of the world in ways both large and small. I find myself more skeptical of official explanations, more attuned to the possibility of hidden truths beneath the surface of everyday life. It's made me acutely aware of the vast machinery of power that operates just out of sight, shaping our reality in ways we can scarcely imagine. But it's also given me a deep appreciation for the power of bearing witness. Though we were unable to uncover the full truth of what happened that day, the fact that we saw what we saw, that we know what we know, feels significant. It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, individual experiences and testimonies matter. As I conclude this account, I'm struck by the enduring impact of that single day in the desert. What started as a simple hiking trip became a lifelong journey into the heart of a mystery that touches on some of the darkest aspects of human nature and institutional power. To my friends who were there that day, if you're reading this, know that our shared experience has bonded us in a way that few can understand. To that first officer, wherever you are, I hope you found peace with what you saw that day. And to anyone who might have information about what really happened in that canyon outside Ridgecrest, I urge you to come forward. The truth, no matter how long buried, deserves to see the light of day. As for me, I'll continue to watch and listen, to question and seek understanding. The mystery of Fossil Falls may never be fully solved, but in sharing this story, I hope to keep the search for truth alive. Because in the end, it's not just about what happened in that remote canyon 25 years ago. It's about the larger question of what other secrets might be hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to have the courage to uncover them. The desert, with its vast expanses and hidden canyons, keeps its secrets well. But as our experience shows, even the most carefully buried truths have a way of surfacing, if only we have the courage to look for them. And so, the mystery of Fossil Falls remains, a testament to the power of the unknown, and a reminder that sometimes the most profound discoveries are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers. In the years since our discovery, I've often found myself drawn to stories of other unexplained incidents, particularly those involving remote areas or government land. I've connected with online communities of people who have had similar experiences, hikers, campers, and outdoor enthusiasts who have stumbled upon things they couldn't explain, only to be met with official denials or unconvincing explanations. These stories, while varied in their details, often share common threads: unexpected discoveries, swift and disproportionate responses from authorities, and a lingering sense that the truth has been deliberately obscured. It's both comforting and unsettling to know that our experience at Fossil Falls wasn't unique. I've also delved deeper into researching the China Lake Naval Weapons Center and other military installations in the desert. The more I've learned about the scope and secrecy of these facilities, the more plausible our theory about a government cover-up becomes. The vast, restricted areas of the desert provide the perfect backdrop for activities that those in power might want to keep hidden from public view. There have been moments when I've been tempted to return to Fossil Falls to see if I could uncover any new clues, or perhaps trigger some forgotten memory that might shed light on what really happened that day. But each time, a combination of fear and respect for the unknown has held me back. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, serving as reminders of the limits of our understanding and the vastness of the world around us. As I've grown older, I've come to appreciate the profound impact that day had on shaping my worldview. It taught me to question official narratives, to look beyond the surface of things, and to trust my own experiences even when they conflict with what I'm told is true. It's made me a more critical thinker, a more observant individual, and paradoxically, a more open-minded person when it comes to considering unconventional explanations for seemingly inexplicable events. I sometimes wonder about the long-term consequences of our discovery. Has our silence over the years allowed something sinister to remain hidden? Or did our stumbling upon that site perhaps prevent future incidents, forcing whoever was responsible to be more cautious? These are questions I'll likely never have answers to, but they continue to weigh on my conscience. To those who might read this account and dismiss it as paranoia or an overactive imagination, I can only say this: I hope you never have an experience that shakes your understanding of reality the way ours did. But if you do, I hope you'll have the courage to speak up, to question, to seek the truth no matter how uncomfortable or inconvenient it might be. And to those who might recognize elements of their own experiences in our story, know that you're not alone. The world is full of mysteries, some of which may never be fully understood or explained. But in sharing our stories, in refusing to let these incidents be forgotten or dismissed, we play a crucial role in pushing back against the forces that would keep us in the dark. As I write these final words, I'm acutely aware that this account may bring renewed attention to events that powerful people have worked hard to keep buried. If that's the case, so be it. The truth, no matter how long concealed, has a way of coming to light. And if our experience at Fossil Falls teaches us anything, it's that even in the vastness of the desert, even against the machinery of government secrecy, the human spirit's quest for truth cannot be easily extinguished. The mystery of what we found in that canyon may remain unsolved, but in sharing this story, in keeping the memory of that day alive, we ensure that it's not forgotten. And perhaps, someday, someone will connect the final dots, uncover the last piece of the puzzle, and bring to light the full truth of what happened in Fossil Falls all those years ago. Until then, I'll continue to watch the desert horizon, to listen for echoes of that day and the whisper of the wind through the canyons, and to remain ever vigilant for signs that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, is fighting its way to the surface. Because in the end, it's not just about solving a mystery. It's about standing up for the principle that in a free society, the truth should never remain hidden, no matter how inconvenient or unsettling it might be. There's something serene about the stillness of the woods at dawn, an almost sacred silence that envelops you. I had driven out to the dense forest near Red Bluff, California, an area I frequently visited both professionally and personally. The towering redwoods stood like ancient sentinels, their massive trunks disappearing into the morning mist. As someone who grew up in Chicago, my connection with nature came later in life, forged through years of service as a fish and wildlife warden. My name is Marius Kowalski. At 42, I'm a straightforward guy, practical to a fault perhaps. The morning ritual of strong black coffee and equipment checks had become second nature over my 15 years of service. That October morning in 2023, I was investigating reports of unusual wildlife activity. Multiple deer carcasses found in patterns that didn't match any known predator behavior. I parked my department-issued truck at the Morrison Creek trailhead, the familiar weight of my duty rifle, a Remington 700, comfortable against my shoulder. Standard gear for a warden, sidearm, satellite phone, first aid kit, and enough supplies for an extended stay if needed. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. The first signs appeared about 2 miles in, tracks unlike anything I'd seen in my career, too large for a mountain lion, wrong pattern for a bear. The stride length suggested something bipedal but massive. As a warden, I'm trained to be skeptical, to look for rational explanations. But these prints defied classification. I documented everything meticulously, taking photos and measurements. Extension cords for scale, GPS coordinates marked. This was going to be more than just another routine patrol. The tracks led away from the established trails, deeper into old-growth forest where the canopy blocked most of the morning light. The first carcass I found turned my stomach. 15 years on the job, I'd seen every kind of predator kill imaginable. This was different. The deer hadn't just been eaten, it had been torn apart with surgical precision. Organs removed, bones cracked open for marrow. But the most disturbing part was the tool marks on the bones. Whatever did this used implements showed intelligence. I called it in, keeping my voice steady as I reported to dispatch. Unit 17 to base. Found evidence of suspicious activity at grid reference Charlie 9. Requesting backup and forensics team. Copy Unit 17. Can you describe the nature of the activity? I paused, choosing my words carefully. Possible poaching case. Multiple kills. Evidence of unusual hunting methods. Understood. Backup is 3 hours out. Do you want to hold position? Looking at the precision of the cuts, the deliberate placement of the remains, I made a decision that would haunt me. Negative. I'm going to track the subject. We'll maintain radio contact. The trail led to a ravine I knew well, a steep-sided cut through the bedrock that dropped about 60 feet to a seasonal creek below. The tracks disappeared over the edge. Standard procedure would be to wait for backup, but something about this felt urgent. Lives could be at stake. I found a route down, picking my way carefully over loose scree. The creek bed was damp, organic matter decomposing between worn stones. The air grew noticeably colder as I followed the water's course. That's when I found the cave. It wasn't on any of my maps. The entrance was partially hidden by fallen timber and vegetation, but it had been cleared enough to allow passage. Fresh marks on the wood showed regular use. I documented everything with my department-issued camera, then switched on my tactical flashlight. The cave mouth was roughly 8 feet high, worn smooth by centuries of water flow. The floor showed signs of traffic boot prints in the mud, recent enough that water hadn't filled them. I drew my sidearm, keeping the light steady. Protocol said wait for backup. Experience said whatever was killing those deer might have human victims in need of immediate help. The passage descended at a gentle angle for about 50 yards before opening into a larger chamber. My light caught reflective surfaces, metal equipment scattered among more organic remains. The scene was methodical, organized. A tarp laid out with surgical precision, tools arranged on a folding table. And the bones, dozens of specimens cleaned and categorized. This wasn't the lair of some animal, this was a research station. The tables held notebooks filled with detailed anatomical drawings and measurements. Specimen jars contained preserved tissue samples. But it was the photos pinned to a makeshift bulletin board that made my blood run cold. They showed the transformation of something human into something else. The first photos were clinical medical examination shots of a subject with severe genetic abnormalities. But they progressed, showing changes that defied explanation. Bone structure altering, muscle mass increasing exponentially, new tissue growth that matched no known species. A journal lay open on the main table. The handwriting started neat and professional but degraded over the entries. Day 47, changes accelerating. Protein synthesis exceeds all predicted models. Subject showing increased aggression, decreased verbal capacity. Day 89, episodes of lost time increasing. Memory fragments suggest continued research during blackouts. Found new specimens in holding area with no recall of acquisition. Day 124, can no longer trust mirrors. The face looking back is not mine. The final entry was barely legible. If you find this, destroy everything. I can't stop the hunts anymore. Can't control when it takes over. The hunger never stops. A growl echoed through the cave deep, guttural, but with undertones that were disturbingly human. I spun toward the sound, weapon ready. My light caught movement at the chamber's far end. Something massive shifted in the darkness. It emerged slowly, deliberately. 8 feet tall at least, its frame a twisted fusion of human and bestial characteristics. Patches of fur covered hypertrophied muscle. Its face retained human features warped into a predatory configuration. But its eyes were aware, intelligent, and in them, I saw recognition. The creature took a step forward, its movements unnaturally fluid for its size. My training kicked in. I fired 3 controlled shots, center mass. The rounds hit, drawing blood darker than it should have been. But the creature didn't fall. It reached up to its neck, touching something that glinted in my flashlight beam. A metal chain holding what looked like a security badge. "Dr. Warren?" I called out, remembering the name from the log books. "Dr. Catherine Warren?" The creature froze. A sound emerged from its throat, not quite speech, but not entirely inhuman either. Its massive hand still clutched the badge, knuckles white with strain. For a moment I saw the battle playing out behind those intelligent eyes, the person fighting against whatever they'd become. The moment broke when my radio crackled. "Unit 17, backup is en route to your last known position. Please respond." The creature's head snapped toward the sound. Whatever humanity I'd seen vanished, replaced by predatory focus. It charged, covering the distance between us with explosive speed. I dove aside, feeling the rush of air as massive claws passed inches from my face. My flashlight clattered away, spinning across the cave floor and casting wild shadows. I scrambled backward, firing my remaining rounds. In the strobing light, I caught glimpses of the creature's wounds sealing themselves, new tissue knitting together with visible speed. The gun clicked empty. No time to reload. I drew my knife, knowing how futile it was against something that size. The creature herded me deeper into the cave complex, away from the entrance, away from escape. We ended up in what looked like a storage room, shelves lined with chemical containers and medical supplies. Warning labels caught my light biohazard symbols, radiation warnings. Whatever experiment created this thing had violated every ethical and safety protocol in existence. I grabbed a container of industrial cleaning solution, throwing it at the creature's face. It roared in pain as the caustic liquid made contact, giving me precious seconds to search for a way out. There, a ventilation shaft high on the wall, installed to clear chemical fumes. I scrambled up the shelving units, metal groaning under my weight. The shaft was a tight fit, but fear and adrenaline are powerful motivators. I crawled through decades of dust and cobwebs, the creature's roars echoing behind me. The shaft ended in a vertical section leading to the surface. I could see morning light filtering down through a grating. Halfway up, I heard metal tear. The creature was ripping into the shaft below me. I climbed faster, my muscles screaming in protest. Just as I reached the grating, I felt claws close around my boot. I kicked frantically, feeling the leather tear. One final push and I burst through the grating, tumbling onto the forest floor. I was back in the ravine, maybe 50 yards from where I'd entered the cave. The morning sun was blinding after the darkness below. I staggered to my feet, preparing to run, but no attack came. Instead, I heard something else from the shaft, sounds that might have been words. End. This. I had one option left. I pulled the emergency flare from my vest and lit it. The magnesium flame cast brilliant red light across the ravine. I hesitated for a split second, then dropped it into the ventilation shaft. The explosion was immediate. The chemicals stored below acted as accelerants, turning the cave complex into an inferno. Secondary explosions followed as other containers ruptured. I backed away from the intense heat, calling in my position to the approaching backup units. The official report calls it an illegal drug lab explosion. The remains found in the cave were too damaged for detailed analysis, and the fire destroyed most of the evidence. But they did recover some things: partial research notes, contaminated tissue samples, and a security badge belonging to Dr. Catherine Warren, formerly of a privately funded genetics research facility. The badge now sits in my desk drawer. Sometimes late at night I take it out and remember those eyes, human eyes in an inhuman face, begging for an end to what that research had created. I think about the choice I made, dropping that flare. Was it mercy, justice, self-defense? Maybe all three. I still work as a warden, still patrol those woods. But I carry different gear now: a larger caliber rifle, incendiary grenades, and a field testing kit for unusual biological samples. Because I know the truth. Dr. Warren's notes mentioned other test subjects, other experiments. And sometimes on quiet nights when the moon is full, I hear roars in the distance that sound almost like words. The thing about horror isn't the moment of terror, the fight for survival. It's the knowledge that follows you home. The understanding that science and ambition can create monsters worse than any legend. And the fear that somewhere, in other secret labs and hidden places, more horrors are being born. I've changed my morning routine. Coffee doesn't cut it anymore. These days I start with a shot of whiskey and a prayer. Because out there in the woods, in the places between what we know and what we fear, there are things that hunt, and sometimes we have to hunt them back. The ground was still damp from last night's rain as I made my way into the dense forest just outside of Eldridge, Oregon. My boots left deep impressions in the soft earth, each step releasing the rich scent of wet soil and decomposing leaves. I'm Evan Harkins, and for the past 30 years, these woods have been my sanctuary. At least they were until that day in late October when everything changed. Growing up in rural Oregon, hunting wasn't just a hobby, It was a way of life. My father taught me to track when I was barely old enough to hold a rifle, showing me how to read the subtle signs that most people miss: the height of broken branches, the age of droppings, the direction of bent grass. By the time I was 15, I could tell you not just what had passed through an area, but when and in what condition. These skills had become second nature, as natural as breathing. That morning started like any other hunting day. I arrived at my usual spot well before dawn, parking my weathered Toyota pickup at the end of an old logging road. The forecast had predicted clear skies, but Oregon's weather has always had a mind of its own. A heavy mist hung between the towering Douglas firs, reducing visibility to about 50 yards and dampening all sound. I checked my gear one final time. My Remington 700 was clean and loaded. My pack contained enough supplies for 3 days, though I only planned to be out for one, and my emergency satellite phone was fully charged. Years of experience had taught me to always be over-prepared. The forest might only be 20 miles from town, but in bad conditions, that might as well be 1,000. The first sign that something was wrong came about 2 hours after sunrise. I'd been following what I thought was a promising elk trail, moving deeper into the old-growth forest where the trees were so tall and thick they created a permanent twilight beneath their canopy. The trail had led me into an area I didn't recognize, which was unusual. After 3 decades of hunting these woods, I thought I knew every ridge and hollow within 20 miles. The silence hit me first. Anyone who spends time in the wilderness knows that a forest is never truly quiet. There's always background noise, birds calling, small animals moving through the undergrowth, insects buzzing, the wind in the trees. But here, in this unfamiliar section of woods, there was nothing. The silence felt physical, like a pressure against my eardrums. I stopped to get my bearings, pulling out my GPS unit. The screen showed my location, but something seemed off about the coordinates. According to the device, I was in an area I'd hunted dozens of times before, but nothing looked familiar. The trees here were different, older, their bark black and twisted, their branches creating unnatural patterns against the gray sky. That's when I noticed the marks on the trees. At first glance, they looked like bear scratches, but something about them made my skin crawl. They were too regular, too purposeful. They started about 7 feet up the trunks and ran down to ground level in parallel lines, deep enough that sap had welled up and dried in thick amber teardrops. But it was the pattern that really got to me. They formed geometric shapes that seemed to repeat from tree to tree, like some kind of bizarre language. I've seen plenty of strange things in these woods over the years. I've found abandoned camps that looked like they'd been torn apart by animals, heard sounds that couldn't be explained, and once found a set of tracks that didn't match any known species. But those marks on the trees were different. They felt intentional, almost like they were meant to be found. I should have turned back then. Every instinct honed by decades in the wilderness was screaming at me to leave, but curiosity is a powerful force. I took out my phone to photograph the marks, but every picture came out blurred, as if the camera couldn't focus properly on the patterns. The temperature seemed to drop as I examined the trees more closely. The air felt thicker, almost gelatinous, and carried a metallic taste that reminded me of blood. I noticed other details that I'd missed at first. The ground around the marked trees was bare, with no undergrowth or leaf litter, just packed earth that looked almost polished in places. The sound, when it came, was so low at first that I felt it more than heard it. It started as a vibration in my chest, like the bass at a concert, but it grew into something that resembled speech, if speech could exist without a human throat to produce it. The sound had patterns, rhythms that seemed almost familiar but refused to resolve into anything recognizable. My hands were steady as I raised my rifle. Years of hunting had taught me to control my fear, to think clearly even when every cell in my body was screaming for flight. The sound grew louder, and with it came a smell, not the natural decay you find in the woods, but something chemical, like ozone and copper and rotting meat all mixed together. When it emerged from between the trees, my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. As a hunter, I'm used to identifying animals by their movement patterns. Every species has its own way of moving through the forest. But this moved wrong. It walked like something that had learned about bipedal locomotion from a technical manual, all incorrect angles and jerky movements that shouldn't have allowed for forward progress. Its height was difficult to judge because it seemed to shift and change as it moved, its form rippling like heat waves off hot asphalt. The closest I can come to describing its appearance is to say it looked like something trying to wear the shape of an elk, but getting all the proportions wrong. Its skin had a texture that changed as it moved, sometimes appearing rough and scaly, other times smooth and reflective like wet stone. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me, not because they were alien or monstrous, but because they were almost human. Dark, intelligent, and filled with an awareness that made my blood run cold. They focused on me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was being recognized, not just as prey, but as something to be studied. I fired. The sound of the shot was deafening in the unnatural silence, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it moved toward me with a speed that shouldn't have been possible given its awkward gait. I fired again and again, each shot finding its mark but seeming to pass through the thing as if it were smoke. The attack, when it came, was almost gentle. One moment I was standing, rifle raised, and the next I was on the ground, my chest burning where its appendages had struck me. My heavy hunting jacket was shredded, and beneath it, my skin was laid open in long, precise cuts that barely bled. I rolled to my feet, decades of hunting having taught me how to fall without losing my weapon. The creature was between me and the direction I'd come from, so I had no choice but to run deeper into the unfamiliar territory. The wet ground made running treacherous, but fear gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I could hear it behind me, moving through the trees with that same impossible grace. That's when I heard the second shot. The sound came from somewhere to my right, sharp and clear in the dense forest. The creature hesitated. I felt rather than saw its pause, and I used that moment to change direction, heading toward the source of the shot. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of someone moving, a tall figure with a rifle, taking careful aim. Another shot rang out, and this time I saw the impact. The creature staggered, actually staggered, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I reached the shooter's position, my lungs burning from the run. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. "Get behind me," he said, his voice steady as he kept his rifle trained on the creature. "Name's Warren Telford. We need to move. Now." I didn't argue. We backed away slowly, keeping our rifles ready as the creature circled just beyond clear sight in the misty forest. Warren led us through the trees with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. After about 10 minutes of careful movement, we reached a small clearing with a sturdy cabin constructed of thick logs. "Inside," Warren ordered, never taking his eyes off the forest. "Quick." The cabin's interior was spartanly furnished but surprisingly well equipped. What caught my eye immediately were the walls, covered in maps, photographs, and notes. Dozens of trail camera pictures showed blurred images of something large moving through the forest. News clippings documented missing hikers and hunters dating back decades. "You're not the first to encounter it," Warren said as he secured the heavy door. "Been hunting these woods for 40 years. Started seeing signs of it about 15 years ago. At first, just tracks that didn't make sense, marks on trees that shouldn't be there. Then people started going missing." He moved to a worn desk and pulled out a leather-bound journal. "My brother Thomas was the first to take it seriously. He was a wildlife biologist, spent 2 years tracking it, studying it. He thought it might be some kind of undiscovered species. That was before... Warren's voice trailed off, but he didn't need to finish. The pain in his eyes told the story. Found his body 3 miles from here, what was left of it. That's when I started hunting it seriously. Over the next hour, Warren showed me his research. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to follow patterns. It was territorial, but its territory shifted. It was intelligent, terrifyingly so, and it learned from every encounter. The bullets that had affected it today were special loads that Warren had developed, blessed by a local tribal elder and mixed with various metals. "Don't look at me like that," he said, noting my skepticism. "I was a skeptic too once, a man of science. But some things in this world don't fit into our neat categories. Some things exist in the spaces between what we think we know." Night was falling, and with it came a change in the forest's atmosphere. The silence deepened, became more oppressive. Warren moved with practiced efficiency, checking weapons and securing windows. He had transformed the cabin into a fortress over the years. Steel shutters, reinforced doors, multiple escape routes. "It'll come," he said simply. "It always does, once it's found something that interests it. And you interested it, friend. Saw that in the way it moved, the way it studied you. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" I spent the next few hours examining Warren's research while he made preparations. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. The creature didn't just hunt, it studied, it learned. Each encounter documented in Warren's journals showed escalating intelligence, adaptive behavior. It wasn't just surviving, it was evolving. The attack came just after midnight. The first warning was a change in air pressure. My ears popped as if I descended rapidly in an airplane. Then came the sound, that same otherworldly not-quite speech I'd heard earlier, but louder now, more complex. Warren was moving before I registered what was happening, positioning himself at one of the reinforced windows with his rifle ready. I took position at another window, fighting down the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. The creature emerged from the forest's darkness like a piece of night given form. In the cabin's exterior lights, its appearance seemed to shift and change, never quite settling into a single shape. But its movements were different now, more purposeful, more controlled. "It's learning," Warren whispered. "Every second it watches us. It's learning." The attack was devastating in its precision. The creature struck at the cabin's weak points as if it had studied the structure, knew exactly where to apply pressure. Metal screamed as shutters were torn away. Wood splintered as something far stronger than natural muscle was applied to load-bearing points. Warren's special rounds seemed to hurt it, but not enough. For every hit we scored, the creature adapted, changed its approach. It was like fighting something that could rewrite its own DNA on the fly, evolving countermeasures to our tactics in real time. The end came quickly. A section of wall gave way and the creature was inside. Warren shouted for me to run as he fired his last rounds point blank into the thing's mass. I saw him engulfed by what looked like living shadow, heard his final defiant cry cut brutally short. I ran. The forest was a blur of darkness and mist as I crashed through it, no longer caring about direction or stealth. Behind me, I could hear the creature following, its movement different now, smoother, faster, incorporating what it had learned from our confrontation. My salvation came in the form of first light. As dawn broke over the forest, the creature's pursuit faltered. I heard that strange sound once more, but it seemed weaker, more distant. When I finally dared to look back, I was alone in the forest. I found my way back to civilization more by luck than skill. My truck was where I'd left it, though it felt like years had passed since I'd parked it there. The authorities found Warren's cabin, of course, but there was little left to find. The structure was torn apart from the inside out, and Warren's body was never recovered. I told them everything, or at least I tried to. The words seemed to lose meaning as I spoke them, the experience already transforming into something my mind couldn't quite hold on to. They found my tracks in the forest and Warren's, but anything else had been erased by the rain that fell that morning. I've spent the months since then going through Warren's research. What little of it survived. The patterns he documented continue, but they're changing. More hikers have gone missing, but in different areas, further from the original territory. The marks on the trees have been reported in new locations, each time slightly different, more complex. Some nights when I can't sleep, I find myself looking at the scars on my chest in the mirror. They haven't healed like normal wounds. Sometimes, when I'm not looking directly at them, they seem to shift and change, forming patterns that remind me of the marks on those trees. I know it's still out there, learning, evolving, becoming something new. Warren was right. Some things exist in the spaces between what we think we know. But what frightens me most isn't the creature itself, but the question that keeps me awake at night. What is it becoming, and what role did our encounter play in its evolution? I don't hunt anymore, can't bring myself to enter any forest, let alone the deep woods around Eldridge. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right and I catch the scent of wet earth and ozone, I wonder if it remembers me. I wonder if somewhere in those dark woods, it's still learning from our encounter, still adapting, still becoming something new. And I wonder if someday it will come to show me what it has learned. This happened to some of my friends and me during the summer of 2021, just weeks after our high school graduation. The memory of that night remains seared into my consciousness, every detail preserved with a clarity that I sometimes wish I could forget. I'm from a small town in North Dakota, one of those places where everybody knows everybody, and the closest movie theater is an hour's drive away. My buddies and I were the stereotypical rednecks of the town, the type who drove lifted trucks with oversized tires and never left home without at least one firearm within reach. It wasn't that we were looking for trouble. It was just the way of life out here, where the closest neighbor might be miles away, and self-reliance wasn't just a virtue, but a necessity. On that particular night, we were doing what most teenagers do for fun in the Midwest, when there's nothing else going on, driving around the back roads and shooting at road signs with our .22s. The air was thick with humidity, typical for a North Dakota summer, and the sunset had painted the sky in deep purples and oranges before surrendering to the darkness. When we got low on ammunition, Gary, not his real name and for good reason, mentioned the old snowmobile warming hut deep in the state forest. His voice had a slight tremor to it when he brought it up, something I hadn't noticed at the time but remembered distinctly now, as if some part of him already knew what we were about to encounter. The moment Gary suggested it, the atmosphere in the truck changed so dramatically it was almost physical. We'd all heard stories about that place, whispered conversations in school hallways, warnings from older siblings, and tales shared around bonfires. People spoke of hearing screaming coming from inside when no one was there, of hunters finding strange markings carved into the trees around it, symbols that didn't match any known language or pattern. Most locals avoided the area entirely, even during hunting season. But we were 17 and 18, buzzed on cheap beer and our own invincibility, and Larry's F-150 was already turning onto the Forest Service road before anyone could voice the objections lurking in the backs of our minds. The road to the warming hut was barely visible in the darkness, more of a suggestion than an actual path. Ancient pine trees crowded the narrow trail, their branches scraping against the truck's sides like skeletal fingers reaching for us. The headlights seemed to be swallowed by the thick darkness ahead, as if the forest itself was consuming the light before it could penetrate too deeply. I had my AK with me, a graduation present from my father, who believed in being prepared for anything, and I found myself checking the magazine repeatedly as we drove deeper into the forest, the familiar weight of the weapon providing little comfort against the growing sense of wrongness that seemed to seep in through the truck's vents. About half a mile in, the forest opened into a small clearing where the warming hut stood in silent vigil. The moment Larry cut the engine, we all felt it. Something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The summer heat, which had been almost unbearable all day, felt different here, heavy, oppressive. Like the air itself was pressing down on us with tangible weight. The silence was absolute, creating a pressure in our ears that made them pop, as if we'd suddenly gained altitude. The normal nighttime sounds of the forest, the rustle of small animals, the calls of nocturnal birds, the endless chorus of insects, had been replaced by a void so complete it seemed to swallow even the sound of our own breathing. We sat in silence, watching the hut through the windshield. The structure was barely visible in the moonlight, its weathered walls looking more like exposed bone than wood. The windows were dark holes in its face, and the door hung slightly ajar, swaying almost imperceptibly in a breeze none of us could feel. The longer we stared, the more the shadows around the building seemed to move and shift, as if they were alive and aware of our presence. Terry, who was sitting in the back seat, suddenly grabbed my shoulder with enough force to leave bruises I would discover the next day. His hand was trembling violently, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, strained and tight with terror. "Guys," he breathed. "Something's watching us." The way he said it made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. It wasn't the normal paranoia that comes from being in a dark forest at night. There was a certainty in his voice that spoke to something primal in all of us. I clicked off the safety on my AK, scanning the tree line through the windows, my hands steady despite the fear coursing through my veins. The silence was shattered by a sound that still haunts my nightmares. A long, low scraping noise, like something being dragged across wood, but with an underlying tone that seemed almost musical in its wrongness. It was coming from the hut, echoing across the clearing with unnatural clarity. We watched in horror as the door, which had been hanging half off its hinges, slowly began to swing open. There was nothing but darkness inside, darker than anything natural. A void that seemed to be reaching out toward us. That's when Terry let out a choked gasp that sounded more like a death rattle than a human sound. "The mirror," he croaked, his voice cracking with terror. "Look in the rearview mirror." What I saw in that mirror will stay with me forever, burned into my memory with the clarity of a photograph. Standing about 30 yards behind the truck was a figure so tall its head nearly reached the lower branches of the trees, easily 15 feet high. It was pale white, almost glowing in the moonlight, but its proportions were all wrong, like something had tried to create a human form from a description without ever having seen one. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands with fingers that looked too long, too sharp, each digit ending in a point that seemed to bend and flex in impossible ways. As we watched, frozen in terror, it took a step forward, but not like a person walks. It moved like a spider, all wrong angles and jerking motions, as if each joint bent in directions that defied anatomy and physics alike. Larry tried to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over, producing only a sickly clicking sound that seemed to amuse whatever was approaching us. The figure took another step closer, and through the rear window I could see it better now. Its face. God, its face. Where features should have been, there was just smooth, white skin stretched tight over a skull that was too large, too pointed, like someone had taken a human skull and pulled it like taffy until it became something else entirely. The temperature in the truck suddenly plummeted, dropping so fast our breath immediately fogged the windows. Frost began creeping across the glass in intricate patterns that looked suspiciously like eyes, despite the summer heat outside. The figure was closer now, maybe 20 yards away, moving with that impossible spider-like gait that made my mind recoil. It moved in a way that broke every rule of how things should move, like watching a video being played backwards and forwards at the same time. In pure panic, I raised my AK and fired through the rear window. The glass shattered, and the sound was deafening in the confined space of the truck cab. In the muzzle flash, I saw the figure clearly for a split second. Its body seemed to ripple like smoke in the wind, and its head had turned completely backwards to face us, revealing a mouth that opened far too wide, filled with what looked like hundreds of needle-thin teeth arranged in concentric circles. The moment the shots rang out, the figure vanished. Not like something running away, but like a candle being snuffed out, there 1 second and gone the next, leaving only the afterimage burning in our retinas. The truck's engine suddenly roared to life with a sound that was almost like a scream, and Larry floored it, tires spinning in the dirt before finding purchase. As we peeled out of the clearing, I looked back one last time through the shattered rear window. The warming hut's door was standing wide open, and in the doorway, I swear this is true, there was another figure, different from the first. This one was crouched low, almost on all fours, its limbs bent at impossible angles. And as we sped away, I heard what sounded like laughter echoing through the trees, but it was all wrong, like the sound was being played backwards through water. We didn't stop until we hit the highway, the truck's tires skidding on the asphalt as Larry took the turn at full speed, nearly putting us in the ditch. Everyone was screaming and talking at once, our voices overlapping in a cacophony of terror and disbelief, except for Barry. Barry sat completely still in the middle of the back seat, his face white as chalk, his eyes fixed on something none of the rest of us could see. When we finally calmed down enough to talk about what happened, Barry told us he hadn't seen anything. Not the tall figure, not the door opening, nothing. But here's the thing that makes it even worse. Barry had been sitting in the middle of the back seat, right between Terry and our other friend. They saw everything from either side of him, but Barry saw nothing at all, as if he had been sitting in a completely different reality from the rest of us. 3 days later, after sleepless nights filled with nightmares, we forced ourselves to go back in daylight, thinking maybe we could make sense of what happened. The warming hut's door was still firmly attached to its hinges, not hanging loose like we'd seen that night. The windows were intact, covered in decades of grime, and the clearing looked almost peaceful in the summer sun. And then we saw something that made us turn around and leave immediately, our hearts pounding in our chests. In the dirt around the truck's tire tracks, we found footprints. They were huge, maybe 2 feet long, and they didn't look human. The toes were too long, too sharp, and there were too many of them. They led from the tree line to where the figure had been standing, but they only went in one direction. There were no prints leading away, as if whatever had made them had simply ceased to exist at that spot. None of us have been back to that part of the forest since that night. We don't talk about it much, even among ourselves, but sometimes when we get together, I catch the others glancing at Barry with a mix of pity and fear. He's different now, quieter, more withdrawn, and sometimes I catch him staring into mirrors for too long, as if he's looking for something, or waiting for something to look back. I've always been a child of the wilderness, born and raised in the small village of Evergreen Falls, nestled deep in the heart of British Columbia, Canada. Our community of barely 500 souls thrives on logging, fishing, and the occasional influx of adventure-seeking tourists who come to tackle our world-class whitewater rapids. For all of my 26 years, I've called this place home, surrounded by towering cedars, crystal-clear lakes, and the ever-present whisper of the wind through the pines. My name is Emily Hawthorne, and this is my story, a tale of terror that unfolded in the shadows of the forest I once thought I knew so well. Growing up, I was no stranger to the ways of the wild. My father, Jack, was a seasoned logger, and my mother, Maria, ran the local general store. But it was my grandfather, Old Joe, who truly shaped my understanding of the natural world and the supernatural forces that lurk just beyond our perception. Old Joe was Nuxalk, one of the First Nations peoples who had called this land home for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, you listened. His weathered face told stories of a lifetime spent in harmony with the land, and his eyes held secrets that sent shivers down my spine. I remember countless evenings spent by the fire pit behind our cabin, watching as Old Joe carefully tended the flames. He'd sprinkle sacred herbs into the fire, sage, sweetgrass, and tobacco, creating a fragrant smoke that he said kept evil spirits at bay. As the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows crept across the forest floor, he'd lean in close and whisper tales of creatures that defied explanation. "There are things in these woods, little one," he'd say, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Things older than time itself. They watch us, always hungry, always waiting for a chance to cross over into our world." He never used their names. Those were forbidden words, too dangerous to utter aloud. But I knew what he meant. Skinwalkers, Wendigos. The very thought of them made my skin crawl. "How do you know if one is near?" I'd ask, both terrified and fascinated. Old Joe would tap the side of his nose. "You'll smell it first. The stench of death and decay, so strong it'll make your eyes water. Then you'll feel it, eyes on your back, a heaviness in the air that makes it hard to breathe. And if you hear it..." He'd trail off, shaking his head. Well, by then it might be too late. I clung to every word, storing them away like precious gems. Little did I know how crucial those lessons would become. Old Joe passed away when I was 16, taking with him a wealth of knowledge that I'm only now beginning to appreciate. His death hit me hard, and like many teenagers, I rebelled. I fell in with a crowd of kids who thought they were too cool for our sleepy little town. We'd sneak out at night, borrowing our parents' ATVs to go joyriding through the forest trails. Cigarettes and stolen liquor became our constant companions as we tried to chase away the boredom of small-town life. My partner in crime was Lily Chen, whose parents ran the local Chinese restaurant. We were inseparable, spending more nights camped out in my backyard than at her place in town. It was easier to slip away unnoticed from my house, with the vast expanse of forest right at our doorstep. Our favorite spot was an old logging trail that wound its way deep into the heart of the coastal mountains. About 5 miles in, there was a clearing by a burbling creek where we'd set up our illicit picnics of warm beer and stale chips. We thought we were so grown up, so daring. We had no idea of the danger we were courting. It was late August, just before our senior year of high school was set to begin. The air was thick with the scent of sun-warmed pine needles and the promise of autumn just around the corner. Lily and I had loaded up my father's ATV with our usual supplies, giggling as we imagined the look on his face if he knew what we were up to. As we set off down the familiar trail, I felt a strange unease settle over me. At first, I brushed it off as guilt, or maybe just first day of school jitters. But as we delved deeper into the forest, the feeling intensified. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I had the distinct sensation of being watched. I wanted to say something to Lily, to ask if she felt it too, but the words stuck in my throat. The forest, usually alive with the chatter of birds and the rustle of small animals, had fallen eerily silent. Even the constant drone of insects had ceased, leaving us in a bubble of unnatural quiet, broken only by the rumble of the ATV's engine. We were about halfway to our usual spot when Lily tapped me on the shoulder. "Em," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Something's wrong." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My eyes darted from tree to tree, searching for some sign of what was causing this overwhelming sense of dread. That's when I saw it, or rather, didn't see it. The forest ahead of us was moving. not in the gentle sway of branches in the breeze, but in a deliberate, almost predatory fashion. Treetops were bending and swaying as if something massive was pushing its way through them, heading straight for us. My grandfather's warnings came flooding back, and with them, a bone-deep terror that threatened to paralyze me. I knew we had to get out of there, and fast. But before I could turn the ATV around, a smell hit me like a physical blow. It was the stench of rotting meat left too long in the sun, of decay and corruption so potent I could almost taste it. Lily gagged behind me, and I felt my own gorge rise. That's when we heard it, a sound that will haunt my nightmares for the rest of my days. It started as a low growl, almost subsonic, that I felt more than heard. It built in intensity until it became a shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the cry of a mountain lion mixed with the wail of a dying man, undercut by a deep, guttural roar that spoke of ancient hunger and rage. I gunned the engine, no longer caring about stealth or safety. We had to get out of there, now. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for the ATV, but I pushed it to its limits. Branches whipped at our faces as we tore through the underbrush, the screams of the thing pursuing us growing louder with each passing second. I don't know how long we rode like that, terror giving me strength I didn't know I possessed. The forest blurred around us, and more than once I felt the ATV start to tip as we took a turn too sharply. But somehow, we stayed upright, the primal need for survival overriding everything else. Just when I thought we couldn't go on any longer, we burst out onto the main logging road. The sudden transition from dense forest to open space was jarring, and I slammed on the brakes, sending us into a skid that nearly toppled the ATV. We sat there, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in unison. The forest behind us had fallen silent once more, but this time it was a silence of absence rather than menace. Whatever had been chasing us seemed to have retreated. Lily and I looked at each other, both of us pale and shaking. Without a word, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes. We lit up, hands trembling so badly we could barely manage it. That's when we heard it. One last cry from deep in the forest, fainter now but no less terrifying. It was followed by a sound like thunder, then a resounding crash that shook the ground beneath our feet. Steeling myself, I walked to the edge of the road and peered down the trail we had just escaped from. About a quarter-mile in, I saw it. A massive cedar, easily 5 feet in diameter, lay across the path. It had been ripped from the ground, roots and all, as if by some unimaginable force. We didn't stick around to investigate further. We rode home in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were safely back in my yard, the ATV hidden away and our contraband disposed of, that we dared to speak of what had happened. What was that, Em? Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to put into words the terror we had experienced, but I knew deep in my bones that we had encountered something ancient and malevolent, something my grandfather had warned me about all those years ago. That night marked the end of our reckless forest adventures. Lily and I drifted apart after that, as if by unspoken agreement. We both threw ourselves into our studies, desperate for the normalcy of everyday life. After graduation, Lily left for university in Vancouver, eager to put as much distance between herself and Evergreen Falls as possible. I stayed, unable to leave the only home I'd ever known. But my relationship with the forest changed. I no longer saw it as a playground or an escape. Instead, I began to study it in earnest, delving into the lore and traditions of my grandfather's people. I took up hiking and nature photography, always careful to respect the boundaries between our world and the wild. I learned to read the signs, to recognize when the forest was welcoming and when it was warning me away. It's been 5 years since that terrifying night, and I've never again experienced anything quite like it. But sometimes, when the wind is just right and the shadows grow long, I catch a whiff of that awful stench, or hear a distant cry that makes my blood run cold. I know now that there are things in this world that defy explanation, ancient, hungry things that lurk just beyond the edge of our perception. My grandfather was right to warn me, and I carry his lessons with me always. To this day, I've never spoken aloud the names of the creatures we encountered that night. Some words are too dangerous, too likely to draw unwanted attention. But I watch, and I listen, and I remember. For those of you who venture into the wild places of the world, heed this warning. Nature is not always benign. There are forces out there older than humanity, forces that view us as nothing more than prey. Respect the wilderness, honor the old ways, and above all, trust your instincts. If you ever find yourself deep in the forest and feel that prickle of unease, that sense of being watched, don't hesitate. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can and pray that whatever is out there doesn't decide to give chase. As for me, I still call Evergreen Falls home. I've made my peace with the forest, or perhaps it's made its peace with me. But I never forget that just beyond the tree line, in the depths of the ancient woods, there are whispers and shadows and things that hunger. And sometimes on quiet nights when the moon is hidden and the wind carries secrets, I sit by my grandfather's old fire pit. I sprinkle sage and sweetgrass on the flames, just as he taught me, and I keep watch. For myself, for my community, and for those who might unwittingly stumble into a world they're not prepared to face. The wilderness is vast and we are small, but we are not helpless. Knowledge is power, and memory is our greatest weapon against the terrors that lurk in the dark. Remember my tale, dear reader, and the next time you venture into the wild, keep your wits about you. For you never know what ancient eyes might be watching from the shadows, waiting for their chance to cross over into our world. When I was a child, I lived in a quaint coastal town called Cedar Grove, nestled along the shores of the Gulf Coast in southern Mississippi. Our house was a sprawling Victorian, surrounded by a dense forest of towering magnolia trees. During spring, their blossoms would unfurl like delicate white stars against the deep green foliage, filling the air with a sweet, intoxicating fragrance. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a slice of paradise, but appearances can be deceiving. I was about 8 years old when the incidents began, events that would haunt me for the next 2 decades. To truly understand the gravity of what transpired, I need to provide some context about myself. My childhood was far from idyllic, largely due to my father's oppressive presence. He was a stern, domineering man whose very footsteps sent shivers down my spine. His constant criticism and harsh demeanor left deep emotional scars, manifesting in a crippling fear of adult men. In the presence of any male figure, I would become a trembling, mute shadow, desperately seeking the safety of my mother's embrace. It was during this tumultuous period that my older sister, Emily, fell on hard times and came to live with us. Despite the circumstances, I was overjoyed. To me, it felt like an extended sleepover, a welcome distraction from the tension that permeated our household. We shared my small bedroom, her presence a comforting buffer against the nighttime fears that often plagued me. One sultry summer night, I awoke with a start. The air felt heavy, charged with an inexplicable energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I became acutely aware that something was amiss. Emily's sleeping form lay beside me, her back turned towards me, but there was another presence in the room. A low, guttural sound, reminiscent of a slowed-down, deepened version of nails on a chalkboard, emanated from the corner near my closet. Curiosity overrode my fear, and I propped myself up on my elbow to investigate. What I saw defied all logic and reason. There, looming in the shadows, stood a figure that could only be described as otherworldly. He was impossibly tall, nearly grazing the ceiling with his head. His skin was an ashen gray, a stark contrast to his shock of snow-white hair. But it was his eyes, or rather the absence of them, that sent ice-cold tendrils of fear snaking down my spine. Where eyes should have been, there were only inky black voids, darkness so complete it seemed to absorb all light. This darkness didn't remain contained. It oozed down his sharp cheekbones like viscous tears. Time seemed to stand still as I stared, transfixed by this horrifying apparition. Then, as if nature itself sensed my plight, the clouds parted, allowing a shaft of moonlight to illuminate the scene. In that silvery glow, I could make out more details of the entity before me. His features suggested African American heritage, with a smattering of dark freckles across the bridge of his nose, and what I could see of his cheeks beyond the dripping darkness. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, emitting those choked, guttural sounds that had initially caught my attention. The being's body was emaciated to the point of being skeletal, its skin stretched taut over protruding bones. Arms unnaturally long and thin reached out towards Emily and me, fingers splayed to reveal what could only be described as claws, wickedly sharp and curved like those of a predatory beast. Logic dictates that such a sight should have sent me into a panic, screaming for help or fleeing in terror. Instead, I felt an eerie calm wash over me, as if the entity was exerting some sort of hypnotic influence. My eyelids grew heavy, and I found myself drifting back to sleep, the horrifying visage before me fading into the realm of dreams. The next morning, I awoke with no memory of the nighttime encounter. It was Sunday, and as was our custom, my mother and I prepared for church. The day proceeded as normal. I ran about the church grounds with my friends, carefree and full of youthful energy. However, my world was about to be turned upside down once again. As the service was about to begin, a group of individuals from the local homeless shelter filed into the church. It was a common occurrence, part of the church's outreach program. But as the third-to-last man crossed the threshold, it was as if a switch had been flipped in my mind. My body went rigid, a numbness spreading from my core to my extremities. The base of my skull began to burn, and my attention was inexorably drawn to the newcomer. It was him, the entity from my bedroom, now in human form. His eyes, no longer empty voids, were a deep brown so dark they appeared almost black. As he fully entered the building, he seemed to heave a sigh of relief, as if crossing that threshold had required immense effort. Our eyes locked, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that he recognized me. A smile spread across his face, a gesture that should have been friendly, but instead filled me with indescribable dread. For a split second his eyes flickered, reverting to the empty, dripping darkness I had witnessed the night before. Panic engulfed me. I ran to my mother, hyperventilating and on the verge of tears. Through gasping breaths, I recounted what I had seen both in my bedroom and just moments ago. As my mother's gaze fell upon the man, the color drained from her face. To this day, she refuses to speak of what she saw, but we never returned to that church again. In the years that followed, I convinced myself that it had all been a product of an overactive imagination, perhaps fueled by the stress of my tumultuous home life. I grew older, moved across the country, and tried to put the incident behind me. But the entity, for lack of a better term, never truly left me. Even now, at 28 years old, I catch glimpses of him in crowded streets or feel his presence in empty rooms. He hasn't aged a day, that same unnerving smile fixed upon his face. The only change I've noticed is in those dark, oily tears that replace his eyes. They now streak past his cheekbones, trailing down to his jawline like inky rivers of despair. The most visceral encounters occur during bouts of sleep paralysis, a condition that plagues me with alarming frequency. In these moments, I find myself fully conscious but unable to move, trapped within my own body. He always appears at the edge of my bed, to my left, his presence triggering an immediate panic response. In these paralytic states, I struggle desperately to move, to scream, to do anything to alert others to my plight. I claw at my eyes, feeling my nails dig into the delicate skin around them, tasting the salt of my own tears. Sometimes I even feel the sharp sting as my nails graze my eyeballs. But invariably, some unseen force snaps my arms back to my sides, denying me even this small measure of control. My efforts then turn to screaming, my throat burning as I try to force sound past my frozen vocal cords. I strain to sit up, fighting against the invisible weight pressing down upon me. But like a marionette whose strings have been cut, I always fall back, my body as rigid and unyielding as a plank of wood. The paralysis begins to lift when I feel the mattress depress beside me, signaling his approach. His hand, cold and rough, clamps down over my mouth, silencing my desperate cries. The background noise of my television, a constant companion I've learned to keep on to ward off nightmares, gradually filters back into my consciousness. He leans in close, his fetid breath hot against my ear as he whispers a soft, raspy, "Shh." His grip on my face tightens, those claw-like nails slowly extending, pricking my skin. I've sought help. Therapists, paranormal investigators, even religious leaders. But nothing has rid me of this malevolent presence. Some days I question my own sanity. Have I created this entity as a manifestation of my childhood trauma? Is he nothing more than a persistent hallucination, a projection of my deepest fears? But in the dead of night, when I feel those eyes upon me, those empty, weeping voids, I know with chilling certainty that he is real. Whatever he is, whatever he wants, he has latched onto me with a tenacity that defies explanation. To anyone reading this, I implore you, if you ever encounter a being like him, do everything in your power to banish it from your life. Don't let it sink its claws into your psyche as it has mine. For once it has marked you, it never truly leaves. It becomes a shadow that follows you through life, always lurking just beyond the edge of your vision, waiting for moments of weakness to remind you of its eternal presence. As for me, I continue to live with this haunting, this perpetual dance with a horror that defies comprehension. I've learned to function, to build a life despite the constant undercurrent of fear. But I never truly rest easy, never completely let my guard down. For I know that in the flickering shadows or the depths of my dreams, he waits, patient, unchanging, and utterly relentless. The entity that first appeared in that house in Cedar Grove has become my lifelong companion, an unwelcome specter that serves as a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and whatever dark realm lies beyond. And as I pen these words, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, in some shadowy corner, he watches and smiles. As I approach my 30th birthday, I find myself at a crossroads. The entity's presence has become an oppressive weight, casting a shadow over every aspect of my life. Relationships have crumbled under the strain of my paranoia, and career opportunities have slipped through my fingers as sleepless nights take their toll. Something has to change. In a moment of desperation, I reach out to Dr. Amelia Blackwood, a parapsychologist known for her unconventional methods. Despite my skepticism, I'm willing to try anything to rid myself of this spectral tormentor. Dr. Blackwood arrives at my apartment on a stormy night, her silver hair gleaming in the dim light. She listens intently as I recount my experiences, her piercing green eyes never leaving my face. When I finish, she nods solemnly. "What you're dealing with," she says, her voice low and steady, "is an entity known as a soul leech. It attaches itself to individuals who've experienced severe trauma, feeding off their fear and negative emotions." Her words send a chill down my spine, but they also ignite a spark of hope. Finally, someone believes me, someone who might be able to help. Dr. Blackwood explains that to banish the entity, we must confront it directly. She proposes a dangerous ritual, a guided meditation that will allow me to enter a trance-like state and face the being on its own turf, so to speak. As we prepare for the ritual, setting up candles and burning sage, I feel a familiar prickle at the back of my neck. He's here, watching, waiting. But for the first time in years, I feel a glimmer of defiance. The meditation begins, Dr. Blackwood's soothing voice guiding me into a deep trance. The world around me fades, replaced by a dark, misty landscape. And there he stands, the entity that has haunted me for so long. Up close, he's even more terrifying than I remember. The darkness dripping from his eyes has spread, covering most of his face like an oil slick. His mouth gapes open, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Why?" I ask, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "Why me?" His response comes not in words, but in a series of vivid images that flash through my mind. I see him as he once was, a man, broken by tragedy and consumed by grief. I feel his pain, his rage, his desperate need to cling to something, anything in the face of overwhelming loss. In that moment, I understand. This being, this soul leech, is as much a victim as I am. Trapped in a cycle of fear and pain, unable to move on, he's been using me as an anchor to this world. With this realization comes a surge of compassion. "I forgive you," I say, the words coming unbidden to my lips, "and I release you." The entity recoils as if struck. The darkness covering his face begins to recede, revealing glimpses of the man he once was. He reaches out, not with claws, but with a trembling hand. I take it, ignoring every instinct screaming at me to run. His touch is cold at first, but gradually warms. A sense of peace washes over me, and I know that this long nightmare is finally coming to an end. The misty landscape around us begins to dissolve. The last thing I see before returning to consciousness is the entity. No, the man, smiling at me. Not the terrifying rictus I've come to fear, but a genuine smile of gratitude and relief. I awake with a gasp, finding myself back in my apartment. Dr. Blackwood is watching me intently, concern etched on her face. "It's over," I tell her, my voice hoarse but steady. "He's gone." In the days and weeks that follow, I wait for the familiar sense of dread, the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. But it never comes. For the first time in over 2 decades, I am truly alone in my own mind. The nightmares fade, replaced by peaceful, dreamless sleep. I begin to rebuild my life, repairing damaged relationships and pursuing long-abandoned goals. The memory of the entity remains, but it no longer holds power over me. As I sit here writing these final words, I feel a profound sense of closure. The haunting of Cedar Grove has ended, not through violence or exorcism, but through understanding and forgiveness. To those who may be facing their own demons, whether supernatural or psychological, I offer this hard-won wisdom. Sometimes the key to banishing our fears is not to fight them, but to face them with compassion. For in understanding the source of our terror, we may find the strength to overcome it. The entity that plagued me for so long is gone, but the lessons I've learned will stay with me forever. And as I close this chapter of my life, I do so not with fear or regret, but with hope for the future and gratitude for the peace I've finally found. The summer of 2018 stretched before us like an endless promise. Kate and I had been scouts since we were old enough to tie knots and start fires, but lately something had changed. The magic was fading, like childhood itself slipping away through our fingers. We didn't know then that this would be our last scout camp, or that the waters of Lake Sajno held secrets darker than its depths. Poland's forests in summer are different from what tourists expect. The trees grow close together, creating shadows that seem alive even at noon. Lake Sajno lies like a mirror among them, reflecting the sky during the day and swallowing all light at night. The nearest city, Augusto, feels centuries away once you're deep enough in the woods. Our campsite sat in a clearing that felt carved out of wilderness itself. Canvas tents formed neat rows, military precision imposed on natural chaos. During the day, it was a place of activity and laughter. But at night, when the forest pressed close and the lake whispered its secrets, it became something else entirely. I remember the moment we arrived, our duffel bags heavy with supplies and expectations. The scoutmaster, Mr. Kowalski, stood at the entrance like a guardian, checking off names on his clipboard. He was the kind of man who believed structure could ward off any danger, natural or supernatural. Maya, he nodded as I passed. Kate. His pen made quick marks beside our names. Remember, this is your last year as juniors. Set a good example. We nodded dutifully, already planning ways to bend the rules without breaking them. That's what being 15 was all about, testing boundaries while pretending to respect them. The first few days followed the familiar rhythm of scout camp. We practiced survival skills we secretly hoped we'd never need, sang songs around campfires that seemed to keep the darkness at bay, and pretended we weren't too old for ghost stories. But the real ghost story, our ghost story, hadn't started yet. The night watch system had been part of scout tradition since before any of us were born. 2 scouts, paired randomly, guarding the camp from midnight until dawn. In daylight, we joked about it. What were we guarding against? Bears? Raccoons? Rival scout troops? But there was something about those hours between midnight and dawn that transformed the familiar into the foreign. The forest became a different place entirely, and the responsibility felt heavier than any merit badge. You'll be paired with Kate, Mr. Kowalski announced during morning assembly, his voice carrying across the dewy grass. Thursday night. I caught Kate's eye across the circle of scouts. She grinned and made a spooky gesture with her fingers. We'd been friends since our first year of scouting, when she'd taught me how to start a fire with wet wood, and I'd shown her how to identify edible mushrooms. Back then, we thought we'd be scouts forever. But things had started changing before we even reached the camp. Other girls our age were getting interested in makeup and boys, in Instagram and parties. Kate and I stuck with scouting, but we could feel ourselves growing apart from it, like a snake preparing to shed its skin. The whisper started on Tuesday night. Zofia and Marek had the watch that night. They came to breakfast the next morning looking pale, with shadows under their eyes that hadn't been there before. We heard things, Zofia said, pushing her porridge around her bowl. Like voices. The forest is full of sounds, Mr. Kowalski interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. Wind in the trees, animals, the lake water lapping at the shore. Your imagination does the rest. But Zofia shook her head. These weren't forest sounds. They were words, like someone asking for help, but wrong somehow. Wrong how? Kate asked, leaning forward. Like the words were underwater, Marek said quietly. Like they were drowning. Mr. Kowalski cleared his throat loudly. Enough ghost stories at breakfast. Today we're learning advanced knot techniques. Everyone finish up and meet at the main flagpole in 15 minutes. But the story spread through camp like smoke, impossible to contain. Each night watch seemed to bring new reports, crackling twigs that formed circles around the camp, whispers that came from nowhere and everywhere, glimpses of something pale moving between the trees. It's just stories, I told Kate as we prepared for our own watch. People trying to scare each other. She nodded, but I noticed she was packing extra batteries for her flashlight. I did the same. Thursday arrived with unusual stillness. The lake's surface was like glass, unbroken by the usual wind ripples. Even the birds seemed quieter, their songs muted as if they were keeping secrets. We spent the day going through normal activities, but everything felt charged with anticipation. During the afternoon swim session, I found myself staring at the deeper waters of Lake Sadno, trying to imagine what lay beneath its dark surface. "Ready for tonight?" Kate asked, floating beside me. The water was cold despite the summer heat. "Of course," I lied. "It's just another night watch." But we both knew it wasn't. The stories had grown more detailed with each passing night. Anna and Tomek, who had Wednesday's watch, swore they'd seen handprints appear on the outside of tents, wet handprints that evaporated in seconds. The camp transformed as darkness fell. Familiar paths became treacherous. Friendly trees turned menacing. Kate and I sat on our designated log, flashlights ready, trying to maintain conversation to keep our nerves steady. "Mom wants me to quit Scouts after this summer," Kate said suddenly. "Says I need to focus on real life." "Real life," I repeated. The phrase felt hollow out here in the dark. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before she could answer, we heard it. The first crack of branches, too deliberate to be an animal. The night unfolded exactly as I remember it, but now every detail seems charged with significance. The way the moon cast shadows that looked like reaching hands. The unusual cold that settled around us despite the summer night. The growing certainty that we weren't alone. When Kate heard the whispers, I wanted to dismiss them. When we saw movement behind the tents, I wanted to ignore it. But then came my fateful decision to use the bathroom, separating us at the worst possible moment. The pale man with the soulless eyes wasn't just a ghost. He was a messenger from a world we'd pretended didn't exist, where death wasn't final and water held memories. The article Kate found changed everything. 2 brothers, 1 sacrifice, both lost to the lake's hungry depths. But it wasn't just a tragedy. It was the key to understanding what we'd seen. The older brother, Tomasz Wojcik, had been a strong swimmer. His younger brother, Marek, was not. Witnesses said Tomasz didn't hesitate when he heard his brother's cry for help. He dove in fully clothed, fighting the lake's cruel currents. Neither body was found for 3 days. We spent the rest of the summer researching Lake Sadno's history. What we found chilled us more than any ghost. Dozens of drownings over the centuries, many in pairs, 1 victim and 1 failed rescuer. The lake had a pattern, a hunger for sacrifice. The local library held newspaper clippings dating back decades. Each story followed a similar pattern. 1 person in danger, another attempting rescue, both lost to the depths. "It's like the lake wants pairs," Kate said as we pored over the articles. "Like it's collecting them." Our final night at camp was marked by another appearance. This time the entire troop saw him. The pale man standing at the lake's edge, water streaming endlessly from his clothes though he stood on dry land. Mr. Kowalski couldn't dismiss this sighting. 20 witnesses, all seeing the same impossible thing. The man raised 1 pale hand, pointing not at us, but at the lake behind him. In the water's surface, just for a moment, we saw reflections that shouldn't have been there, faces of all those the lake had claimed, pairs of victims reaching up through the years. We left scouting after that summer, but not for the reasons our parents thought. How could we continue pretending to master the wilderness when we knew what really lurked in its depths? Kate and I stayed friends, bound by a secret that no one else would understand. We learned that some kinds of knowledge change you forever, like knowing that bodies of water can have memories, that ghosts can try to warn the living, that some places collect tragedies like others collect rain. Years later, Lake Sadno still claims victims. Each summer brings new reports of drownings, always in pairs. But now there are also reports of a pale man who appears on the shore, trying to warn people away from the water. Some say he appears only to scouts. Others claim he shows himself to potential rescuers, trying to break the lake's cycle of double tragedy. Kate and I know better. We know he appears to those who need to learn what we learned that summer. that some places hold darkness deeper than any lake, that growing up means facing truth stranger than any campfire story, and that the real ghosts aren't the ones that haunt places, but the ones that haunt decisions. I visited Lake Saginaw last summer, standing on the shore where our camp once stood. The water was as smooth as glass, reflecting the sky like a mirror. For just a moment, I saw him again, the pale man with the soulless eyes. But this time he wasn't asking for help. He was offering a warning, the same warning Kate and I now carry. Some waters run deeper than depth. Some stories don't end when you stop telling them. And sometimes the most haunting ghosts are the ones that try to save us from becoming ghosts ourselves. My name is Wesley, and what I'm about to share changed not just my driving habits, but my entire perspective on what exists in the dark corners of our world. I live in central Vermont, where the Green Mountains carve deep valleys and create isolated pockets of civilization that seem frozen in time. The region's history is as deep as the valleys themselves, with stories of frontier conflicts, abandoned settlements, and mysterious disappearances woven into the fabric of local lore. Growing up here, you learn to respect the mountains, not just for their natural dangers, but for the secrets they keep hidden in their shadowy hollows and dense forests. The landscape itself seems alive with whispers of the past, and there's a palpable sense that the wilderness is always watching, always waiting. It's a beautiful place, make no mistake, but there's an undercurrent of something ancient and unknowable that runs beneath the surface of everyday life. Every month I make the drive to Providence to visit my grandparents, a journey that used to take me through a tiny community called Pine Hollow. The name itself seems innocuous enough, but something about that place always set my teeth on edge. The way the mountains loom over the handful of buildings, the peculiar silence that seems to swallow all sound, and the feeling that you're being watched from the surrounding wilderness. It all contributed to a sense of unease I could never quite shake. Pine Hollow isn't much more than a cluster of weathered houses and a single general store that looks like it hasn't changed since the 1950s. The few residents I've seen over the years always seemed guarded, their eyes wary, and their conversations hushed. It's as if the entire town is holding its breath, waiting for something to break the eerie calm that blankets the area like a shroud. 3 summers ago, I was making my regular visit to my grandparents' house in Providence. They lived in one of those classic New England colonials with a wraparound porch, the kind that defines Rhode Island's historic charm. We spent 2 wonderful days together, with Nana forcing second helpings of her famous clam chowder on me, while Pop shared stories of his days working at the old textile mill. It was the kind of visit that reminds you what matters in life: family, love, and the simple joy of being together. But as often happens, time slipped away from me, and I left much later than I should have. The sun was already dipping below the horizon as I said my goodbyes, promising to call when I got home and reassuring them that I'd be fine on the drive back. If only I had known then how wrong I would be. The autumn sun sets early in Vermont, and by the time I approached Pine Hollow, darkness had completely enveloped the landscape. The temperature had dropped below freezing, forcing me to drive cautiously on roads that could hide patches of treacherous black ice. My headlights carved through the darkness, barely illuminating the dense forest that pressed against both sides of Mountain Road. The few houses I passed were dark, their windows like empty eye sockets staring out into the night. The radio only picked up static, adding to the eerie atmosphere that seemed to thicken with each passing mile. The trees loomed overhead, their bare branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, creating abstract shadows that danced across my windshield. The world outside my car felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl, as if the very darkness itself was breathing, watching, waiting. That's when it happened. From the right side of my headlights, about 30 feet ahead, something emerged that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The creature was impossibly tall and thin, its body a void that seemed to absorb what little light touched it. It moved on all fours, but not like any animal I'd ever seen. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a spider made of broken glass. The thing leaped into the road with an otherworldly grace that made my stomach turn. I slammed on the brakes, thankful that the road was dry enough to prevent a skid, and found myself frozen in place as this entity fixed its attention on me. The sudden stop sent my heart racing, and for a moment, the only sound I could hear was my own ragged breathing echoing in the confines of my car. The details of its appearance are forever burned into my memory. Its body was emaciated beyond anything possible in nature, with joints and vertebrae protruding through its pitch-black skin like knots in dead wood. The way it moved reminded me of those stop-motion creatures from old horror films, but this was no special effect or costume. This was something ancient and wrong. As it approached my car, each movement was deliberate and predatory, like a mantis stalking its prey. When it reached my window, it raised one of its horrifically long limbs and began tapping on the glass with what I can only describe as claws. They weren't like animal claws. They were more like pieces of obsidian, sharp and black and somehow wrong. The tapping sound echoed through the car, each impact sending a jolt of fear through my body. I wanted to look away, to close my eyes and pretend this wasn't happening, but I found myself unable to tear my gaze from the nightmarish figure before me. The creature's face is what haunts me most in my nightmares. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, black nothingness, broken only by 2 pinpricks of white light where eyes should be. These weren't really eyes in any conventional sense. They were more like distant stars viewed through an infinite void. The absence of a mouth or nose made it even more terrifying, as if this thing existed outside the need for such basic biological necessities. As it peered into my car, I felt a presence in my mind, an alien consciousness that seemed to be probing my thoughts, sifting through my memories like a child rummaging through a toy box. The sensation was invasive and cold, leaving me feeling violated in a way I've never experienced before or since. What started as tapping soon became more aggressive scratching, the sound of its claws against the glass sending shivers down my spine. The screech of whatever material those claws were made of against my window created a sound that seemed to bypass my ears and drill directly into my brain. I should have driven away immediately. Any rational person would have, but terror had paralyzed me. The creature made no sound beyond the scraping of its claws, which somehow made the encounter even more terrifying. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath. Time seemed to stretch and warp, and I found myself wondering if I had somehow slipped into some alternate reality where such creatures could exist. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize what I was seeing, to find some explanation that could make sense of this impossibility, but every attempt fell short. Minutes passed like hours as I sat there, gripping my steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, watching this impossible thing try to find a way into my car. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature tensed its body and launched itself back into the darkness with explosive force, moving like some hellish fusion of frog and spider. The darkness swallowed it completely, leaving no trace of its existence except for the fresh scratches on my window and the racing of my heart. For several long moments I remained frozen, half expecting the creature to reappear. When it didn't, a wave of relief washed over me, quickly followed by an overwhelming urge to flee. My hands shook as I fumbled with the gear shift, nearly stalling the car in my haste to get away from that cursed stretch of road. I don't remember much about the drive home. I know I broke every speed limit between there and my house, taking curves far too fast and praying I wouldn't encounter any ice. The landscape blurred past my windows, and every shadow seemed to hold the potential for another horrifying encounter. My mind raced with questions and theories, each more outlandish than the last. Was this some undiscovered species? A government experiment gone wrong? Or something even more sinister? Something that challenged the very foundations of what I thought I knew about reality. The next thing I clearly remember is stumbling through my front door, where my wife Madeline immediately recognized that something was terribly wrong. She's always been my anchor, my connection to normalcy and safety, and that night she proved it once again. She guided me to our living room where a fire was crackling in the fireplace, wrapped me in her arms, and just held me while I shook. She kissed the top of my head and whispered reassurances, not pushing me to explain until I was ready. The warmth of the fire and the familiar scent of our home began to ground me, slowly pulling me back from the edge of panic. Madeline's steady presence reminded me that there was still good in the world, still light to balance out the darkness I had encountered. When I finally found my voice, the words came out jumbled and frantic. How do you explain seeing something that shouldn't exist? How do you put into words an encounter that challenges everything you thought you knew about reality? Madeline listened without judgment, her presence helping to ground me in reality as I struggled to process what I'd experienced. She asked questions gently, helping me to organize my thoughts and memories. As I spoke, the reality of what had happened began to sink in, and I found myself alternating between fear, disbelief, and a strange sense of wonder at the realization that the world was far more mysterious than I had ever imagined. In the years since that night, I've found a new route to Providence. It adds almost an hour to my journey, but I'll never drive through Pine Hollow again, especially not after dark. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder about that thing. Was it unique, or are there more of them out there? What would have happened if my window hadn't held? What did it want? But mostly I wonder how many other people have encountered it on that lonely stretch of mountain road, and whether they were all as lucky as I was to drive away. I've done research, scouring local newspapers and online forums for any similar reports, but I found nothing concrete. Just vague stories and urban legends that might be attributed to overactive imaginations or too much drink. Part of me wants to go public with my experience, to warn others about what lurks in the shadows of Pine Hollow. But I know how it would sound. Who would believe me? The scratches on my car window lasted until I finally sold it in 2022. I never told the new owner where they came from. Some truths are better left unspoken, especially when they involve the things that lurk in the shadows of places like Pine Hollow, Vermont. But I carry the knowledge with me always, a secret burden that has changed how I see the world. Every time I drive at night, every time I find myself in a remote area, I can't help but scan the darkness, wondering if I'll catch another glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. The experience has left me with a profound respect for the unknown, and a keen awareness that there are things in this world that defy explanation. And sometimes, late at night when the wind howls through the trees and shadows dance on the walls, I swear I can hear the faint sound of obsidian claws tapping on glass, a chilling reminder that the barrier between our world and whatever lies beyond is far thinner than we'd like to believe.